And the members are never going to cross it, as long as the leader's there. And I didn't want to be that kind of teacher. I want to be the kind of teacher that shows that even if you are not perfect, you can still dare to step forward and say, but you know what? I know more than I knew 20 years ago or 40 years ago. I know more than the average person. I have something that might be able to help some people. And I don't have to be perfect, because I'm not teaching you how to be perfect here on earth. I'm teaching you how to take the next step from where you are at in consciousness. And I'm demonstrating that by showing how I have taken step after step without claiming to be perfect. And I just realized that that was the kind of teacher I wanted to be, if you can call that a teacher. And I think it goes for all of us. You know, we are all that kind of teacher if we just realize that this is who we are. We're all teaching somebody. You meet somebody, and it's not a goal that they should make their ascension the next week. It's the goal that you meet them at whatever level of consciousness they are at, and then you help them take the next step. And then you show them that there is a path they can follow. And why do you need to be perfect to teach that? So, anyway.
There's always the promise that one day you'll be there.
Yeah, that's true.
That's the trick.
And one day you will be there, and then there's the saying that wherever you go, there you are. So you see, you're always going to be somewhere, and that's what I realized, that there is no final stage here on Earth. Again, because this is such a low planet. It has never been the goal to demonstrate perfection on Earth. And with all I understood about Jesus, I realized he did not come to demonstrate how to be the perfect human being on earth. And he never claimed to. This is the idolatry that Christianity has built around him ever since. And the same thing with Gautama Buddha. He did not come to demonstrate that. He came to demonstrate a path that everybody can follow. And so if you take these people, and obviously in order to demonstrate the path, you may have had to walk it yourself, and therefore you may be ahead of the average person. But it doesn't mean that you're perfect by any means. And so, there was a time when I thought about this, what is enlightenment? What does it mean? And the conclusion I came to is that if it makes any sense to talk about enlightenment, it's when you have awakened from the dualistic state of mind. And what is it that the dualistic state of mind does? It puts labels on everything. So if you are stepping forward and say, I'm enlightened, isn't that a label you're putting on yourself? So have you transcended the level of consciousness where you need to label everything? And where you need to create differences between people? Because what does the label do? It sets some people apart from others. That's the only function it has. At least when it's in duality and there's a value judgment associated with it, that it's better to be enlightened than not to be enlightened. And I just recently, when I was in Korea, in a hotel room, in every hotel room in the United States, there's a Bible. But in this hotel room in the Olympic Park in Seoul, there was a Bible and a Buddhist book, Buddhist scriptures, which I thought was really cute. So I picked up the Buddhist book and I flipped it open, and there was one quote from the Buddha where he says that enlightenment and non-enlightenment, there comes a point, not with these words, I can't remember exact words, but where you have transcended both. And you see that both were just aspects of the same consciousness. Namely, the dualistic consciousness that wants to define everything in terms of opposites and label one as better than another. And it hit me, that I had never quite understood that before, because I had read this before, that there actually comes a point where it doesn't matter whether you're enlightened or not. But this was the first time I understood it, because the way most people see enlightenment, it's a dualistic concept. And so there comes a point where you see that this is just part of the game that's being played on earth, where, some people are not enlightened and some people are enlightened. And then you define this goal, wonderful goal there. And then all of a sudden you set up this scale of value between those who are enlightened and those who aren't, and those who are closer and those who aren't closer. And it's just all that game, and it doesn't mean anything.
Don't the Buddhists say before enlightenment a chop wood and carry water, and after enlightenment a chop wood and carry water?
Yeah, and the Zen Buddhists, they will also say focus on being fully present in whatever you're doing now, and don't worry about this, because this goal there comes a point where the goal becomes a distraction. And that was also something I realized from the Ascended Masters, because they started saying this, that they have given us the concept of a spiritual path, and it's valid. But there does come a point where you have to realize that built into the idea of a path is that you are here, and there's a goal out there, and you haven't reached it. And then we get back to this that I talked about before with the Greek philosopher Zeno, who the paradox is, can you actually walk from here to Amsterdam? Because first you have to walk half the distance, and then half of that, and you can always divide the distance into smaller and smaller increments without ever arriving. And I think that's what we do in the dualistic state of mind when we have this goal. Enlightenment is always out there, and we can always define more conditions we need to fulfill. So the Masters are saying that there actually comes a point where you have walked the spiritual path for so long that you need to recognize that it's no longer useful to you. You need to start accepting that you have arrived somewhere. Not necessarily a final destination, but you have arrived at a certain level. And that ties in with, there was a person in Korea who asked me, have you attained some degree of Christhood, or have you attained Christhood? And I said yes, because I realized that there comes a point where if you're not acknowledging that you have made progress on the path, you're actually not denying yourself, and you're denying the progress. And so you have to acknowledge that, but you also have to acknowledge that it's by no means final. There's no final stage in Christ. That's why even in the Ascended Realm there's progression. I remember the first time I heard about Ascended Masters, it was presented to me like these were perfect beings, they were immortal beings. And I immediately said, I'm not interested in that, because there's no growth. If there's no growth, what's the point? And then it was later I realized that that was actually not a correct interpretation I've heard, because even in the Ascended Realm there is progress. And they are also evolving.
You know the way when Jesus says that he needs us to become Christ, like at what level does he mean? Like is it the same level he was at, or is it a different level?
Well, that's a good question, because it's again this, what is Christhood? You know, and the tendency has always been that you define based on, for example, Jesus' example. You define this is Christhood. And then you set up this goal way up there that you have to work towards. And it's not necessarily invalid, because the average person is not anywhere near to Christhood. So you have to walk a path. But it's also important to realize that those of us who have walked the spiritual path for a time, and we have applied ourselves, we have made progress. And that's the point I realized many years ago, that I had to acknowledge that I've been in the Ascended Master's teachings for 15 years. I had really applied myself, and I had made progress as a result of that. And for me, when I think back at it, that was the beginning of Christhood for me, where I was by no means at a high level, I was by no means at Jesus' level, but I was willing to acknowledge that I had made progress, because I had reached a higher state of consciousness than I had when I started. And I was willing to acknowledge that I had a higher level of consciousness than the average person. And that's the beginning stages of Christhood. Now, it doesn't mean that you feel you're better than others, you know, and you start putting other people down. Of course not. It means that you're willing to help people. But it's just, so Christhood can be many different things. It's basically really when you become aware that you reach a certain level where you now have something to offer other people. To me, that's the beginning stages of Christhood. And then you can go up from there. So that's what he means. And I think most of you here will be able to make a switch in the mind, if you haven't done it already, where you realize that you have reached that level where you have something to offer other people.
And he says like the 10,000 that are in embodiment now, that have a measure or level of question. does he mean sort of where we're at now, or does he mean sort of something higher?
Well, yeah, it could be both. It depends on where you're at right now. But I think what he means with the 10,000 is that they had reached a certain level of Christhood before they came into embodiment. Where they were.
Who are they? Where are they? Like, how do we know?
Look around.
Well, there's not 10,000 here.
No, of course not. And the reason there's not 10,000 here is that these people are not meant to all come into the same organization, because they are meant to be in all areas of society. Because many times, they're actually meant to bring forth some kind of idea that creates change in a particular area. So you can look at all of these people that are bringing forth new ideas in many fields. It can be science, it can be art, religion, whatever, politics, whatever, and they have a certain measure of Christhood. They come up with a new idea that shifts society. And there are probably people who are in computer companies who have had a certain level of Christhood because they had a vision beyond the average, and they brought forth the whole computer industry, which took society into a different level. People who created the internet, they had a certain level of Christhood.
It's just that when you read that, or when I read it, I start to just get the image of the way Jesus was in his time, and it seems sort of something that's so beyond, like.
And that's very understandable, because we have 1700 years of programming from when they set Jesus up as the only Son of God, therefore being totally unreachable for the rest of us. But we can't compare this. I mean, first of all, because we are in a different time where the kind of miracles that Jesus performed back then is not really what the masses are going for today, because the consciousness is higher, where people should be able to recognize the path without having these outer manifestations. There's no Ascended Master organization where they've had these outer visible manifestations like that. And so, but it's also because there are many more people in embodiment today that have a degree of Christhood. And that's why it's important that for ourselves that we don't see it as this unattainable goal up there that's so far from us. And it's also important that we don't start to feel better than others. But I think when you start having Christhood, it sort of fades away, this need to judge yourself.
Well, he's obviously frustrated because, in a sense, he feels it's not happening or it hasn't happened yet. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether he's frustrated, but he of course realizes that many of the 10,000 have become stuck and not really recognized what they came into embodiment for. And of course he wants them to awaken to their potential, and because my understanding is that there are many life streams on the planet that have a certain level of Christhood, but there were 10,000 specific souls that made a promise, as far as I understand it, 2,000 years ago, to actually stay in embodiment for the next 2,000 years and help Jesus fulfill his mission. And it's not that they are necessarily higher than all of the other people on the planet. Many other spiritual people on the planet. There are many people in the Buddhist tradition, for example. But these were 10,000 specific souls, many of them from Venus, that made this promise to stay in embodiment for the next 2,000 years to help his mission be fulfilled, so that it wouldn't be buried by the fallen beings and by the disinformation, and so that people would understand that he came to teach a path, and that he came to be an example, not the exception. And so those are the ones he would like to reach and awaken, so that they dare to step forward and say, there's a whole different approach to Christianity. There's a whole different way to look at Christianity.
The Ascended Masters are talking about 144 levels.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that? Because, as you said, there's no limit. But how can I relate these 144 levels for example in Christ?
Well, there's 144 levels of consciousness that's possible on Earth. You can keep going up, but once you go above the 144th level, you can't stay in embodiment, you ascend. So that's the ongoingness, you know. So you're ongoing until you reach the 144 level. You can still stay in a physical body, but then you can no longer stay in a body, and then you ascend, and you go beyond that.
How do you know that?
Well, I think you know when you get close to the end, and before that it doesn't really matter. What matters is you keep taking one step at a time.
Because it's not so, because our consciousness is growing, but also the level will be also growing to the higher level.
Well, as the planet moves up, yes, the scale is moving up. So this is why the masters are saying that it's important for us to raise our consciousness, because when a certain number of people overcome a certain level of consciousness, they can raise the whole scale, which means that what is now the lowest level, you can't stay in embodiment if you are at that low level. You would have to go either to another planet or into the astral plane. And so that is how the collective consciousness is raised that way. Because you get some of these very dark life streams that are dragging the planet down, like Hitler and Stalin and Mao and those people. They're not allowed to take embodiment again. But that requires that there's a certain group of people who have transcended the consciousness, that they are actually here to outpicture so that we can see it.
So I thought also about people, if you will have examined 2,000 years this year, you have the learning, the material learning for 2,000 years, you know, you have the final examine. It is like the same we have now, because if you go back to the Iron Antiquities, they learned about the 30s, and they don't growing anymore, because they have the teachings from 60 years ago. So about this section, we have conditional, or we have the roots. And if you are finally learned all that you can do the balance plane, you are 100% student, and then about your have to examine to do this now is here. And you have the material of about 7 years ago. I think so you don't have you go to the process of ascension anymore.
No. But I don't think you could ever ascend by just following the outer teaching and doing the outer rituals. But I think that the masses were limited by the fact that back then this was what they judged that people could grasp. And I was just talking about it with somebody, with you, about even the Summit Lighthouse. They were also presenting, very focused on the outer path, that if you were a member of the organization, followed the rules, gave the decrees, then you would automatically balance your karma, and once you had balanced 51% of your karma, you just ascend. And it was never really said that way by the masters, but it was said in the popular culture in the organization. And to me, even though I was a member of it for a number of years, that never resonated with me, because I realized you have to change your consciousness before you can ascend. And it was the same with the I movement. But the masters, again, it's like they have to start somewhere and give people something that they can use to raise their consciousness to the next level, and then they give a higher teaching.
They give them a false promise.
Well, they didn't give them false information, a false promise, because they never really made the promise. It was, in my opinion, it was people who construed it that way, that they projected on it that this was what was being said. But you could say that some people turned it into a false promise because they interpreted it.
Because I was there.
Yeah.
Because I very tried to be more. So I changed. So I put with a lot of people, they stay there.
Yeah. And that's what you have seen in all of the organizations they have sponsored. There are still people who are believing that Blavatsky gave forth the highest teaching that the masses will ever give, and that all they need to do is be in theosophy and follow the rules and the dogmas and this and that, and then they'll ascend. The same with the I Am Movement, Bridge to Freedom, Summit Lighthouse. And I think the reality of it is that these organizations are still valid for a certain range of consciousness. Because what's happening is that back then, there were only very few people who could grasp theosophy, for example. Even though it actually had quite a following at some point. But there was still only relatively few people. And so what's happening is the collective consciousness is being raised, and there's more and more people who can understand some of these teachings. And at the same time, the masters give it in a higher teaching. And if you look at it, what is it really about? It's like Julianne and I were talking about. The higher you go, the more responsibility you take for yourself and your path. So the false promise, for example, that was created by the Catholic Church, is the automatic salvation. You are a member of the Catholic Church, you're baptized, you follow a few simple outer rules that aren't really so difficult to follow, and then you'll be saved. And all of those who are not in the church won't be saved. And that's the fallen being's concept of salvation. But because people were indoctrinated with this for so long, the masters had to give them some kind of in between, some kind of steps in between. And so they also gave that impression that here was the violet flame, which was the most efficient way ever given to transmute karma. And once you had transmuted your karma, you would ascend. And that was what people were ready for. And then today they're giving a teaching that says, no, you have to change your entire consciousness before you can ascend. And it makes no sense that you can ascend to the spiritual realm and become an immortal being if you still have those tendencies in your consciousness of being selfish and whatever that caused you to make the karma you have. Right? So it's obvious that that's the direction it's going in. And who knows if there are higher levels that will be given at some point. Whether to me or somebody else, I don't know. Maybe there's already a higher teaching given that I'm not aware of, because I'm not able to grasp it. I didn't know. I've learned a very simple thing in my time of association with the masters, and that is that it's very wise not to take the consciousness we have here on earth and use it to project onto the masters what they are like, what they are thinking, why they're doing what they're doing. Because we can't fathom it. We are still in this very linear state of consciousness. The masters have a totally different state of consciousness.
I have a question. How do you change your consciousness?
Well, that is a good question, because it happens in a way all the time. And many times it just happens spontaneously. So I think all of us who have found a spiritual path, we have been doing it all our lives, because we're just open to it. And so I think the main condition is to simply be open and not, first of all, not think you know everything, or think you don't have to change. Like, I have met Christians who believe that they do not have to look at their psychology, they don't have to change their state of consciousness, because they have declared Jesus Christ to be their Lord and Savior, and that is the only requirement for salvation. And I asked one of these one time, I said, so are you telling me that if Hitler on his deathbed had confessed Christ, he would have gone to heaven? And he looked like I had hit him in the forehead with a hammer, because he never thought about this before. And then he said very hesitantly, well, based on everything I have been brought up to believe, I would have to say yes. But it was obvious he didn't believe it. And what I said to him was that it's obvious that a person with Hitler's consciousness cannot go to heaven. He has to change his consciousness. But anyway, that was a sidestep. I think it just happens because we're open to it. And we're constantly looking for a deeper understanding. And it's like when you have a deeper understanding, when you suddenly see something you didn't see before, your consciousness shifts spontaneously. And I think that's the main thing. Of course, when you become aware that there's a spiritual path and there are certain steps you can follow, I think you can consciously speed up that process a lot. And that's what the Master has given tools for, because part of raising your consciousness is to transform the energy in your four lower bodies, because that energy will pull you into certain thought patterns, emotional patterns, behavior patterns. So by lessening that pull, it's more easy for you to see the illusion that's keeping you trapped. It's basically, you could say that when you see an illusion that has limited you, your consciousness spontaneously shifts. Because when you see the illusion, you're free of it. I mean, you can't see that something is an illusion and at the same time be trapped in it. It's almost impossible. So, but I think, of course, you can do a lot consciously by always having, I mean, it's become so ingrained in me that there's always a part of me that's listening for some insight or some impulse, and it often comes from other people. It can also come from my higher self. It can also come from something I read, where suddenly I see something I didn't see before. I see something about myself. Why am I thinking this way? Why am I doing this? And it happens almost, not necessarily every day, but it's certainly on a weekly basis. I have some kind of insight about myself, some kind of limitation I see, that I have been having this illusion, or like I said, I've been trapped in a certain image of how I should be as a spiritual teacher, and even as a person. And I think when you see that, that's when you shift. So by being open to that, and of course then you can study books that talk about it. I mean, many times when you read a spiritual book, you have these aha experiences. And I think that's when your consciousness shifts. So there are many of these very, very small steps. But then, of course, the Master is talking about 144 levels. And I think it takes many of these smaller shifts before you transcend a certain level and come up to the next level. So it becomes a little more difficult to know where you are at in terms of these levels. But I think actually, if you follow the course, the path of self-mastery, and do these books, I think you begin, when you go higher up in the course, to get a feel for where you're at in consciousness. Because of course not everybody starts at the 48th level when they find those books. And it doesn't matter so much, are you at the 56th level or the 63rd level, but it's important for you to recognize that you're above the 48th, because you're no longer into these selfishness that you see, and you're not willing to manipulate other people and that kind of thing. And I think it's important for you also to know when you're above the 96th, because there's a certain different dynamic that comes into play there, where you have to become, I think once you start getting up towards the 96th level, you have to depersonalize your life, really depersonalize it. And where first of all you don't take offense about what people say, but also you're living to serve some greater cause than just your own interests. And I think if you don't make that switch, then you can actually start going downhill again. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
More than expected.
Okay. Yeah?
What I understand, there was one important thing of rising consciousness is decision making. Because what I see is, often I see what is wrong with me, for example, but I still cannot change my behavior, so I see it. But what is for me more important is I really transcend the behavior pattern or thought pattern, that I'm free of that.
Yeah.
So this is like it seems it's a two steps: seeing and then transcending the pattern of behavior or whatever it is. So you do a different choice in the same similar situation. When you do this, then it's like an exam. You have done it, and now you are next level.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because at every level there are decisions that need to be made consciously before we are free of a certain illusion. And we often, if we have seen an illusion, we often test it several times sometimes, where we meet people who are tempting us to react to them the way we used to do, for example. But there are also other decisions. It's a good point with decision making, because there are other decisions that need to be made. But you can make that decision that you are always willing to look at anything in your psychology. And once you make that decision, it becomes easier to see this. I'm thinking also that, well, it becomes a little complicated, but there was a point where I made a shift where, up until that point, I had seen many things in my psychology, but it had always sort of been forced upon me, and it had been unpleasant when I saw something, because there was a resistance in me towards seeing something. Because I felt, it was again this, I felt I should be, ideally I should be perfect, so every time I was confronted with the fact that I'm not perfect, it was painful. And I made a shift at some point where it became a lot easier for me, because I gave myself permission not to be perfect. And and so it was like I still once in a while have a resistance to seeing something, though. But it's a lot less than it used to be, because it's not as painful for me to see something. I've somehow made this shift where it's just part of the path. And you know, there's going to be illusions you have to overcome. Like Valerian says in the latest book, for each of the 144 levels, there's a certain illusion you have to overcome. And he's actually even saying that if you had descended to earth and taken embodiment, you would have to go down through these levels, and for each level you will take on a certain illusion. And in order to go back up, you have to consciously get rid of the illusions. And so once I realized that, it was not as painful for me, and so it becomes easier to make that kind of like a